Okay, the last lecture in the section on China is about the Qing dynasty. And then the second part will come to modern China. So Qing literally means clear or pure. And as you can see from the map, this is the biggest Chinese empire we've seen so far, pretty close to what it eventually be in modern China. And the rulers were actually considered to be a different ethnicity than most Chinese people, so from Manchuria. And Manchurians today still consider themselves to be a separate ethnicity than other Chinese people. So this is when we see a more direct relationship with the West. There's always been connections with the Western world, with China, but it was through the Silk Road, and that's an indirect connection. And we saw more direct connections happen during this time. In 1514, the Portuguese had made their way to China, and they started trading with the Portuguese. And then 1715, the Chinese limited all European trade to the ports in Canton. Surely the Chinese government had seen what Europeans had done around the world and wanted to prevent themselves from being victims of the type of imperialism that they saw. And they would have to fight with that throughout the Qing dynasty and into the modern era. So during this time period, the imperial court was located in what's called the Forbidden City of Peking, and it's inside the modern day city of Beijing. It's still around. Whenever they had the modern revolutions, they kept it. And you can see how it's really, really organized and rectangular. The area is huge. The walls are 15 miles long. But once the emperor rose to the throne, he could never leave outside of these walls. And that included all of his wives and consorts as well. So in a way, it was this incredible place that was organized just for him according to feng shui principles, which is a type of way of organizing human spaces using Taoism. And they would have special priests who would determine this type of thing. Even though it was designed in this really nice way, these people could never leave. So in a way, it was kind of a prison. Over time, by the end of the 19th century, the emperor really didn't have too much in the way of power himself. It was really the monks who were eunuchs, or I'm sorry, they weren't monks, but just eunuchs who ran the government. And if you're not familiar with what eunuchs are, eunuchs means a man that had all of his genitals removed, just everything. And you're probably wondering, that seems kind of extreme. Why would anyone want to volunteer for such a thing? The idea was that within Peking, there was not supposed to be any other male energy there. So as a result, if men wanted to work there, they did to take out their genitals, and that was believed to take out some of their male energy. I don't think that would work, but that was the idea. So you still might imagine, why would anyone volunteer for this? This is kind of like a lifetime working for this guy. Part of the reason why is because elite families, if they could get one of their sons into the imperial palace, then they could have influence over what's going on. The emperor can never leave, so he can't really see what's going on in the rest of China. So as a result, this is a way to influence the emperor and get what you want. So after a long time, the emperor was kind of isolated, and it was really the eunuchs that were running China through the elite families that had gotten them in there. So it's kind of a prison, but a beautiful prison. The other thing that is unusual about it is that normally in feng shui, people wouldn't live in a space with this many straight lines. Generally, you would look at a natural area and you try to have lots of curves and avoid straight lines, long lines of sight, entrances and exits that go right across from each other. But since the emperor was considered to be a godlike figure, his place was organized in a way that was different than regular people. But since regular people have to live with the emperor, and the emperor needs to do regular people stuff sometimes, uh, they would design some spaces that were more in line with normal feng shui principles, and it would almost like copy nature in other spaces, so that people could live in a more human area. So you can see again when you see it from above, it's organized very cleanly, all rectangles and squares. But within there, we see some curved spaces, and we'll look close up at that. So the imperial compounds are directly on the cardinal directions, just like ancient elite tombs. They face south to protect from evil spirits from the north. So same idea with the tombs and in line with Taoist principles. So the idea with this is to show, since the emperor can never leave, this is a microcosm of the universe. It shows order and symmetry. So we're still talking about Confucianism, but also to emphasize the closeness of the emperor to the gods. Remember, in Confucianism, to run a government, it's in line with the ancient divine emperors. And the modern emperor is kind of considering himself to be divine as well at this time. So this is an example of one of the places that's designed to make it look like it's in a natural area. So all of this stuff would be landscaped to give you a human space that you could be in, along with feng shui principles. So this is the emperor's palace and courtyard. Microcosms of nature represent a Taoist paradise called the Isle of the Immortals. So for the emperor and his family, there's a way for them to get to paradise, but in life. And you can see how there's lots of curves with the water, curves going through this seemingly wooded area. But again, this is all landscaped and all created on the spot. So in Europe, over time, there became a big trend where after trading during the Ming Dynasty for a lot of Chinese items like ceramics, in France especially, Europeans became obsessed with China. But they didn't have, in the 18th century, much in the way of direct contact with China. So most people didn't know what Chinese people look like, and they had no idea. So it's a good idea to kind of like look at this picture and try to pick out things that you think might look Chinese, that are authentic to what we've seen so far. Not other things where it's Boucher, the French artist for this one, getting kind of creative and imagining what China would be like. So pause the video and look at some things, and then I'll make a list myself. So obviously the faces, when we see them, they're very European looking. Sometimes the men have these like kind of long, straight mustaches, but still not much of what we actually saw in China. The figures are wearing robes, but they're not like the type of clothes, which I'll show you in a moment, that people wore during the Qing dynasty. The hair is very wrong. The buildings have some qualities that are close to right, but not quite right. And when we get to Japan and we see some of these Chinese type temples, yes, in Japan, we'll be able to see how they actually look. But the idea is there. And then obviously the skin tones are what they are. Surprisingly, for most classes, for some reason, camels, that is authentic. They did have camels in Beijing. And the palm trees as well. Not necessarily in China, but close to trees that you would see that, if it was an elite area that Chinese people might bring in. But most of it, the colors, and even this weird kind of thing that I guess is supposed to look like a plankin, is done the wrong way. So not much there. But the one thing that is authentic, if you look, we see these ceramics. They wouldn't be selling ceramics this nice just on the street probably, but the ceramics are authentic. They look like the ones that were made in China in the Jingdezhen kilns that we talked about before. And the reason why those are authentic is because those are the things that Boucher would actually see. So we called this like trend and a little bit of an obsession with China, Xinhua Seri, and kind of seeing the Chinese people in this othering way as being kind of like quaint or whatnot. even though Boucher probably wasn't aware of it, it did serve the imperial interests of the West. There were some direct contacts with China, though, where we get authentic images of China that made their way into the West. So this is Lang Xining, whose Italian name is Giuseppe Castione. The inauguration portraits of Emperor Qianlong, the Empress, and 11 imperial consorts. So this is the emperor, and this scroll goes on, and it shows all of his first wife, the Empress, and then his consorts, which means girlfriends. So how this came about that Castione ended up painting the emperor is the Jesuits, who are a particular brotherhood of monks, Catholic monks, in Europe. And they had a lot of presence in Spain and in Italy. So the Pope at this time had real political power, and the Jesuits in some ways were his army, sometimes for violence. So, you know, if there was another European country that was trying to come in there and not be Catholic anymore, he would try to exert his power through Jesuit warriors, but also through propaganda and diplomacy. And that was the idea with him sending the Jesuits there. He wanted to see what China was all about and try to curry some favor and, you know, make them Christian. The Pope also worked unwittingly or not towards the aims of Western imperialism. So painters were some of the people that were sent, and some of them found great favor with the emperor, including Castione. He taught the Chinese some Western technique, and I'm going to tell you about what they thought of these techniques in a moment. And he learned Chinese technique. So this was painted on the day the emperor ascended to the throne. So a good thing to do would be to look at this portrait and do what we did with the Boucher. Pick out elements that are very Western, and then pick out elements that fit along with what we've seen in China so far. So pause that, maybe make a list, and then I'll tell you my own list that most classes come up with. So the first thing people notice is the medium. It's very Chinese. We've seen it before. It's a hand scroll. It's ink and color on silk. Other things they notice are the kind of flatness. We don't necessarily have a background or a foreground. And that a lot of the lines are quite precise compared to what you would see in the 18th century in Europe. That was during the end of the Baroque, sometimes called the Rococo, and European painting at that time was very expressive with lots of heavy paint. We're not seeing that here. It's more like a Chinese style. However, there are some things that are very Western. The kind of shading that we have in here, it's subtle, but it's there, is something that we would see in the West. Most of the time in China, there would be less attempts at shading and more attempts at contour lines. So it's a good mixture of these two different styles. It's actually going to be very influential in China, where people will take these same ideas in even more creative and individualistic ways, and also to create meaning. So again, you can see some of the same elements here, this mixture of some Chinese styles, line work, certainly medium, but also shading from the West. So this one was probably made or ordered to be made by Castione in a way to have like a kind of like propaganda effect on the West. So it was commissioned by the emperor, and it's based on poems by Qianlong. And it may have been to convince the West of military might. So you can kind of see, first off, it's about a surrender, but you can get an idea on what is being portrayed here and why the emperor would like what he would see. We see, again, Western and Chinese elements. We have a Western type of perspective where we have a very short ground plane and things disappear off into the background, not like what we would see in China, and some shading within, but also some line work that's similar to what we had seen in China before. And some people would be in China really impressed by this, and others not so much, which I'll talk about in a moment. But what you can see how it could work as propaganda is we see this vast army, and it's very organized and very under control. And then you can see the people surrendering, not looking so organized, looking like they're wearing very simple clothes. And you could see how this could work as a way to possibly convince the West of military might. And at this time, the emperor had very good reason to doubt Europeans because, yes, they did have their designs and they wanted to get a closer connection to the types of resources that they could get from China and the types of arts without having to go through the Chinese government. So it's interesting at the time, a lot of people saw this as a problem in a similar way that they saw some of the problems that were happening before the Yuan dynasty that led them to be conquered. And basically this foreign influence, it may be exciting or interesting or new or just novel. But at the same time, uh, you should be wary and also respecting Chinese traditions, which are believed by this writer to be more sophisticated and more artistic than Western styles. And if you listen to what he's going to say in this quote, it'll make a lot of sense with what we've been talking about with what was most valued in Chinese art, going all the way back to 1700 years before this. So Westerners are skilled in geometry, and he explained how they paint a scene in perspective is represented from broad to narrow, calculated mathematically. The mural paintings depicting palaces look so real that one is almost tempted to walk into them. But he saw the foreign style as completely deficient in the mastery of the brush. All we see with such art is nothing but craftsmanship, and it cannot be therefore classified along with paintings of quality. So what he's not seeing here is sympathetic responsiveness to Qi. He's seeing a creation of an image, but not art, not individuality, not the soul of the artist or the spirit of the artist. So yes, in a way he's criticizing because he's using Chinese standards for this art, which totally makes sense. But at the same time, this is part of a kind of cultural war. I think that the critic here has a really good point because it matches up with decolonization movements in modern times where you embrace your own culture, and it's a way to strengthen your culture and be able to battle against imperialism. So there's an artistic point here, but there's also a political point to be made. So Castiglione, he made some pictures where it's pretty accurate as far as the clothing that's being worn. You can see it here. Men were required to have their head shaved in the front and not cut their knots in the back, so everybody has those. Everyone here except for the emperor is a eunuch, and the clothing that we see is very accurate, as well as the buildings and the area. We're seeing everything as it was.